Hey guys, so in today's video I'm going to be addressing an email I recently received from Rohan Prabhu. And in the email he talks about how he recently encountered the Gospel of Thomas, and he noticed that a lot of the ideas, a lot of the concepts that are communicated through that Gospel are very similar to the teachings of the Vedas. And he asked me to share my thoughts on the Gospel of Thomas. So in this video I'm going to be introducing you guys to Gnostic Christian literature and giving you some of my advice when it comes to approaching these texts. Stay tuned. So the most important thing to understand about the Gospel of Thomas is that it belongs to a collection of writings referred to as Gnosticism, Gnostic Christian writings, which have become relatively popular, especially in the last 10 or 20 years. And most of these Gnostic teachings are in fact a result of a discovery that was made in the 1940s. In a site called Nag Hammadi in Egypt, there was a young boy who discovered a collection of documents, and they're referred to as the Nag Hammadi Library. Now, it's a fascinating point of history to know where these ideas come from. You see, in the early centuries of Christianity was beginning to diverge into a lot of different schools of thought. Most especially, you had Orthodox or Catholic Christians who were following the directions of the bishops. And the bishops were the disciples of the apostles themselves. So for instance, we can connect several early church fathers, or rather apostolic fathers, directly to one of the 12 apostles each. The Gnostics, on the other hand, were of an opinion that salvation came through knowledge, specifically secret knowledge, which they termed gnosis. It was the idea that by being privy to this secret knowledge, one would be saved from death. You see, it's important to understand that the Gnostic texts, the Gnostic documents, were really just a repository of all the random nonsense that was revolving around Christianity in the early centuries of the church. But when it comes to preserving accurately the teachings of Jesus Christ, I don't really have a lot of confidence. In fact, we can date a lot of these documents. It's quite clear they contradict each other much more than the biblical texts do. And there are a lot of ideas that seem to be borrowed from Egyptian mythology and mixed in with mystery religions. So for the most part, I don't put a lot of authority on Gnostic Christian texts. And in fact, I side with the more orthodox viewpoint on things. That being said, there is one exception. The Gospel of Thomas. You see, when we study the early texts of the New Testament, we find in the Orthodox documents 4 specific Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, the first 3 of those Gospels are referred to as the Synoptics: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're referred to as Synoptics because they are said to have been written from the same point of view. They have similar timelines, similar teachings, and similar perspectives on Christ. Now, many people believed in the research that centered on these documents that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source. Mark might be one of the earliest Gospels ever written. In fact, tradition tells us that it was written by St. Mark when he was dictated the life of Christ by St. Peter in a prison in Rome. So that Matthew and Luke took a teachings text of Jesus, a sayings text, which traditionally is referred to as Q, and they combined Q with the Gospel of Mark to form their Gospel.
When scholars began to notice and convince themselves that Mark was being copied by Matthew and Luke, they could also notice there were some other texts in Matthew and Luke that were in a somewhat similar sequence and with a similar content. They didn't come from Mark, so they postulated another source. The German scholars who did it called it Quelle, which meant the source, simply. I call it the Q Gospel.
No material evidence for the existence of a hypothetical Q Gospel has ever been found, yet its influence is unmistakable. There are obvious similarities within Matthew and Luke, indicating that the writers may well have taken their material from the mysterious Q source.
So for years and years, this Q text was only ever theorized. No one had ever found just a teachings text of Jesus. Until, of course, we discovered the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is a relatively short gospel, but it does not include any events. It doesn't talk about Christ's birth, his teachings, his resurrection, his crucifixion, no historical events. It's nothing other than a collection of sayings, just like what was hypothesized for the Q text. Now, what's really fascinating about the Gospel of Thomas is that it contains many canonical teachings. We find the parable of the sower. We find the parable of the fisher. We find the parable of the pearl of great price. We find many teachings that are perfectly reflected in the Synoptic Gospels. In fact, I would say that most of the Gospel of Thomas is canonical. It mirrors perfectly what we see in Matthew and Luke's Gospels. So this tells us that we have a unique window into some unique teachings. That's to say, we have an opportunity to perhaps look at unknown, truthful teachings of Jesus Christ. But one of the other things that's really fascinating when we study the Gospel of Thomas is that the Gospel of Thomas gives us a very different point of view when it comes to some of the teachings of Jesus Christ. Most especially, I think, is pronounced the teachings that revolve around the kingdom of heaven. I'm going to read for you guys a couple of quotes. Jesus said, "If those who lead you say to you, 'See, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father." His disciples said to him, "When will the repose of the dead come about? And when will the new world come?" Jesus said to them, "What you look for has already come, but you do not recognize it." Jesus said, "It is I who am the light which is above them all. It is I who am the all. From me did the all come forth, and unto me did the all extend. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me." His disciples said to him, "When will the kingdom come?" Jesus said, "It will not come by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying, 'Here it is,' or 'There it is.' Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and men do not see it." Jesus said, "He who will drink from my mouth will become like me. I myself shall become he, and the things which are hidden will be revealed to him." So there are a number of very mystical and profound teachings that we find in this gospel. And I think that the thing that people find the most fascinating about these passages in particular is that Jesus is not describing the kingdom of God as a historical event. You see, in traditional Orthodox teaching, the kingdom of God is something which will arrive at the end of the world. The Messiah will come down from the heavens on a white horse, and a flaming sword will come out of his mouth. He'll smite the devil off the face of the earth, and there will be this great apocalyptic battle which will usher in the beginning of the kingdom of God. These concepts, of course, were largely borrowed from Zoroastrian mythology, which was started in ancient Persia. Zoroaster was a prophet who believed that there were two gods, a good god of light and a black god of evil and darkness. And at the end of history, there would be this epic battle between the two of them, and this would usher in the end of the world and a kingdom, a paradise here on earth. Of course, these Zoroastrian ideas had a huge influence on the writings of the prophet Daniel, and it really came to underpin and build a foundation for all apocalyptic thinking that went into later Christian tradition. Of course, many people have been debating for quite a number of years as to whether or not Jesus genuinely believed in this kind of an apocalyptic vision. There are certain passages in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke which seem to suggest that Jesus was looking forward to this apocalyptic kingdom. But then we also find passages which seem to indicate that Christ's understanding of the kingdom of God was much more of a realization rather than a historical event. And the Gospel of Thomas would seem to support this. There are other passages we read, such as, "When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty. Does not Jesus say, 'Whoever finds himself is superior to the world'?" These are very mystical teachings, and in fact, what they describe me the most of, actually, is Buddhism, really, or even Hinduism. It's very similar in the sense that it's describing God as a realization, and the kingdom of God as a realization. It describes discovering the wealth of spiritual life within yourself. You see, this runs rather contrary to the Orthodox idea that the salvation of God is going to come from outside of us. It's gained by participating in the physical sacraments, and that historically God is going to come down from the sky and rescue us all from the devil. That's a very literal interpretation, and I think even the Orthodox Church has struggled with this more literal interpretation of the text, whereas within these Gospels we see a much more mystical interpretation. And I think that if we look at the history of religious ideas, it becomes pretty evident that this is in alignment and in agreement with perennial philosophy. It's the idea that the spiritual kingdom that we're seeking lies within ourselves, and that it is only through solitude, silence, repose, and inner exploration that we come to know ourselves. and that knowledge of oneself opens the doors to heaven. It opens the doors to the kingdom of God. Come to know yourselves, and you will become known. But the Gospel of Thomas is a unique opportunity. It gives us an opportunity to show us that the teachings of Jesus Christ were in agreement with what we're hearing from India, and that it was united with a greater global tradition of spiritual understanding, which is in agreement with the teachings of Sufism, the teachings of Shaivite Hinduism, and Karmakaju Buddhism. I mean, you can go the world over and you can find these perennial ideas. So I hope that answers some of your guys' questions. And as always, I'd encourage you to hit up the description. Send me an email with your experiences or your questions. I'll post that down in the comments or in the description down below. And I'd love to hear your comments and your feedback. Please don't forget to subscribe and like. And thanks for watching.